Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to learn more about the U.S. Highway 52 four-lane project between Minot and Voltaire. This project is being undertaken by the North Dakota Department of Transportation in cooperation with the Federal Highway Administration. My name is Mike Huffington. I'm with Alteg Engineers, and I am the consultant project manager for this project. And today I will be introducing the project, providing a summary of work completed to date, and discussing some of our next steps. So to start with, I want to provide a quick background on the project. Back in 2021, the North Dakota DOT undertook the development of passing lanes along US Highway 52 between Minot and Carrington. This overall corridor was divided into three separate projects for construction purposes, the westernmost of which ran roughly from Logan to Balfour and was constructed last year during the 2023 construction season. The four-lane project that we are discussing today runs from Minot to Voltaire. So as you can see on your screen along this current corridor, there are eastbound and westbound passing lanes currently installed between Logan and Sawyer, as well as between Sawyer and Velva. As we were going through the project development process for the passing lanes projects, we received a number of public comments really pushing for four lanes, particularly for this segment of US 52 closer to Minot. Local leaders and elected officials heard those concerns, and during the last legislative session, were able to get funding allocated to initiate this four-lane study. So real quick, I just want to touch on the phasing and schedule for this project. We currently are in phase one, which is the preliminary engineering study. As part of this phase, we're completing initial alternatives development and preliminary engineering, completing a lot of our field surveys, both topographic and environmental, completing a traffic analysis, starting this initial stakeholder and public engagement, and ultimately we will conclude with a decision document. In phase two, the focus will be on completing an environmental document in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And then finally, phase three, which would be final design, which includes that final design, right-of-way acquisition, and permitting. Looking at the schedule, phase one is expected to wrap up the end of this year. We'll then be transitioning into developing that environmental document through 2025, which will include additional opportunities for public engagement and comment, and then final design through 2026 and the first part of 2027. I will note this project does not currently have funding for construction, so we do not have an estimated construction timeline. Looking at our project corridor, our study area begins near Minot, where the current four-lane section of US 52 ends and goes until just past Voltaire, where it ties into an existing eastbound passing lane that was installed in 2023. We've divided the overall corridor into 6 different project segments, driven primarily by changing constraints and opportunities along the corridor, which I will expand upon in a little bit when we get to the alternatives. So now I'm going to quickly touch on some of the known constraints, and we'll start with right-of-way and the railroad. So the area we zoomed into here is just east of Sawyer near the county line. The purple lines are existing right-of-way, and as you can see on the left side of the screen, all the way from Minot up until this location, the North Dakota DOT currently owns excess right-of-way along the south side of US 52. This right-of-way extends approximately 200 feet from this current roadway center line. As the project corridor begins to parallel the railroad, the amount of existing right-of-way narrows, and there's no longer that excess right-of-way to the south, and throughout the remainder of the corridor, the existing roadway is centered within the current right-of-way. Zooming out and looking at this stretch between Sawyer and Velva, the majority of this segment parallels the Canadian Pacific Rail line and is one of the more constrained segments of the project corridor from a right-of-way perspective. Floodplains are another constraint. as you can see in this map, there are a number of FEMA map floodplains that cross the project corridor. So as we work through our project design, we will be coordinating with local floodplain administrators, and it will ensure that anything we propose is in compliance with floodplain regulations. Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act provides protection for park and recreation lands, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and historic sites during transportation project development. Along this project corridor, there is a designated snowmobile trail shown in blue on the screen, which is eligible for protection under Section 4F. This trail is located within the ditch of US 52 between Sawyer and Velva, and is part of the project. We will need to ensure that use of that trail remains and is not limited or inhibited as a result of the project. As we get closer to Voltaire, there are a number of parcels along the project corridor that are subject to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wetland easements. If we are acquiring right away from these parcels, we will need to coordinate with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regarding potential impacts. Then lastly, the Velva flood protection levy. There is currently a flood protection levy around the community of Velva that crosses US 52 on the west side and abuts US 52 on the east. We have reached out to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and have had some preliminary discussions regarding this levy. Based on those discussions, we will need to ensure that our project complies with the Army Corps' Section 408 program, which provides guidance and regulations pertaining to the alterations of civil work projects. I'm now going to touch on some of the studies that have been completed to date, which includes a topographic survey, aquatic resource delineation, cultural resource inventory, field noise data collection, habitat surveys for threatened and endangered species, and geotechnical investigations. Touching on a few of these surveys in a little more depth, the cultural resources work associated with the project is still ongoing, but a number of cultural sites have been identified along the project corridor. Due to federal regulations associated with cultural resources, the location of cultural sites cannot be publicly disclosed, but I will note that some of the cultural sites that have been identified have influenced the alternatives currently under consideration. Our project team has completed habitat surveys for the federally protected northern long-eared bat and Dakota skipper. Habitat for the Dakota skipper in particular has been identified along the project corridor, and our team will be coordinating with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service during the next phase of project development to address any potential impacts to the species. Geotechnical investigations are also still ongoing. This corridor has some rough terrain and steep slopes, particularly the portions that parallel the Souris River Valley. The purpose of the ongoing geotechnical investigations is to determine if there are any landslides or actively moving soils along the project corridor, but also to assess the type of soil present along the project corridor to allow us to determine how steep we can go with our inslopes and our back slopes. As you can see in this figure, if we have soils with a higher shear strength, we can get by with steeper slopes, which really reduces the total footprint of the project and the amount of dirt that needs to be moved. Now I'm going to touch on some of the findings of the traffic operations study that was completed earlier this year, starting with looking at the average daily traffic volumes along the corridor. These numbers shown in red in this figure are the 2023 ADTs, or average daily traffic counts, and the numbers shown in blue are forecasted 2047 ADTs. As you can see, the average daily traffic volumes really decrease the further away from Minot you get. Between Logan and Sawyer, current ADTs are just shy of 5,000 vehicles per day. That number drops to about 3,700 between Sawyer and Velva, and then between Velva and Voltaire, we're down to about 2,300. One interesting thing to note is the percent of truck traffic, which ranges from 21 to 32%, which is pretty high. And in fact, US 52 as a whole is has one of the highest percentages of truck traffic of all the highways within the state. Looking at level of service, which level of service is a qualitative measure for characterizing traffic flow, whereby a level of service A represents free-flowing traffic with no congestion. Conversely, a level of service F would represent the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be a total breakdown in traffic operations and basically stop and go traffic during rush hour type scenario. Looking at the tables on the right, the top table represents level of service conditions under 2023 or current traffic volumes, whereas the bottom table represents anticipated level of service under forecasted 2047 traffic volumes. As you can see under the existing configuration, so the existing 2-lane highway that is out there now with the recently installed passing lanes, the majority of the corridor operates at a level of service A for both AM and PM peak traffic periods, with exception to the segment closest to Minot, which operates at a level of service B during the PM peak hour. North Dakota DOT guidance is to maintain a level of service D or better. So looking purely at the traffic volumes, there does not appear to be a traffic congestion issue under current conditions. The two columns on the right show anticipated level of service under 4-lane roadway scenarios, and under both 4-lane scenarios, which include a 4-lane with a flush center median and a 4-lane with a pressed center median, the entire corridor would operate at a level of service A. Moving to the bottom table, this shows anticipated level of service under 2047 traffic volumes, and it is very similar to the 2023 table, except under current conditions, the northernmost segment would operate at a level of service B under both AM and PM peak traffic volumes, but under any of the 4-lane scenarios, we would again anticipate a level of service A across the board. Looking at the crash history along this corridor, I want to focus on the two right columns on the upper table, which show the observed crash rate and typical crash rate ranges, which are based on the roadway type. All the observed crash rates fall within typical ranges, but it is worth noting that the segment between Sawyer and Velva is nearing the upper end of that typical range. So the majority of the overall project corridor is classified as a rural highway, with exception to the urban segment through Velva. This segment has curb and gutter, a reduced 40-mile-an-hour speed limit, and a much higher access density relative to the rest of the corridor. Velva also has the only pedestrian crossing along this corridor, which is the crossing located at the intersection of North Dakota Highway 41. There are currently no other parallel pedestrian facilities along the corridor, and based on the pedestrian data collected as part of the traffic operations report, the current pedestrian crossing doesn't appear to see a lot of use, with only 6 total crossings observed over a 13-hour observation period. Before we get into discussing the alternatives, I just want to bring attention to the fact that we have also formed a stakeholder working group composed of the entities that you see on the screen. This group has met twice thus far, once back in April and most recently on October 7th. As I mentioned previously, this project is really being driven at the local level, so we felt that in addition to our public outreach efforts, we also want to have a smaller working group of local officials and elected representatives to help drive this project in the right direction and provide feedback throughout the project development process. So moving on to project alternatives, we really have two primary 4-lane build alternatives, starting with a divided 4-lane with a depressed center median. The typical section for this alternative would be very similar to the current configuration along US Highway 83 between Bismarck and Minot, with two 12-foot driving lanes in each direction separated by a depressed center median and 8-foot paved outside shoulders. This alternative would have a design and posted speed limit of 70 miles an hour. Some of the primary pros of this alternative would be an increased level of protection from head-on crashes, controlled left turn access, fewer impacts to the traveling public during construction, and it would be consistent with the current 4-lane section along US 52 as you come into Minot. The cons would be a larger overall footprint and higher overall cost. Second alternative would be a divided 4-lane with a flush paved center median. This alternative would have the same 12-foot driving lanes in each direction and 8-foot outside shoulders, but instead of a depressed center median, it would have a flush paved 20-foot median. A representative typical section within the state would be what currently exists along US 85 between Watford City and Williston. This alternative would have a design and posted speed limit of 65 miles an hour. Some of the pros of this alternative would be a smaller overall footprint. It would utilize more of the existing pavement from those recently installed passing lanes, would have a lower cost, and it would be easier to install new left turn lanes in the future. Primary con associated with also this alternative would be that reduced level of protection from head-on collisions relative to the depressed median alternative. As I mentioned previously, we divided the overall corridor into 6 different project segments driven primarily by changing constraints and opportunities along the corridor. We'll now step through each of those segments, highlighting alternatives under consideration for each and some of those challenges and opportunities. The first segment is from the beginning of the project until just west of Sawyer, and the alternatives under consideration for this segment include the depressed median alternative with the new 2-lane being constructed to the south and the flush median alternative. The map on the screen has a slider bar, allows us to compare alternative footprints. On the left is the divided depressed alternative. On the right is the divided flush. The area in green represents project construction limits, but I do want to remind you that those geotechnical investigations are still ongoing. So the construction limits that you see on the screen are preliminary and represent a worst case scenario. It is very likely that the majority of those limits will be pulled in and reduced as design progresses. So at this location, one constraint that we have is crossing of a large overhead transmission line operated by the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA. Looking at a cross section of both the depressed and flush median alternatives, both alternatives will result in impacts to that existing south tower. So we will be coordinating with WAPA to properly account for these impacts and any necessary adjustments to that line. Another thing we want to touch on is access improvements. And these improvements are relative to the project as a whole, not just segment 1. As you can see in this figure, we will be looking to try and align offset access points to improve overall operations and also reduce the number of crossovers along the corridor. Additionally, we will be looking to try and improve the grades at intersecting roadways and approaches. Ideally, we would be looking to maintain a 7% grade or less, and also provide a storage platform at intersections, which is a flatter section right at the intersection that improves driver visibility and also makes merging onto US 52 easier for drivers. Moving on to segment 2. This segment is from just west of Sawyer to the county line between Ward and McHenry counties. The 2 alternatives under consideration for this segment are the depressed median with a new 2-lane roadway to the south and the flush median, but with a shifted crown to the south. So rather than widening the existing roadway evenly on both sides, the widening would be primarily to the south. The reason for The shifted crown is due to a number of constraints to the north, including the Sawyer Water Tower. Looking at this figure, you can see the middle image shows the flush median option equally expanded to both sides, and due to the existing steep back slope leading up to the water tower, any expansion to the north would result in that water tower being impacted, whereas the depressed median alternative or the flush median alternative with a shifted crown avoids those impacts. As we move on to the Second Avenue intersection, I want to first note that during our stakeholder group meeting, it was mentioned by a few of the stakeholders that the North Dakota DOT should possibly consider closing this intersection at Second Avenue. Closing this intersection is not currently part of the project, but we did want to bring it to the public and allow the public to weigh in on if there is a desire to keep it open or to see it closed. The current grade of Second Avenue is quite steep, and there's not currently a storage platform at the intersection. Due to the steepness of that existing grade, if we went with the depressed median option, we would not be able to make any improvements to this intersection. However, the flush median option with that shifted crown would allow for the inclusion of a storage platform at this intersection. As we move to the eastern end of this segment near the county line, this is where the corridor begins to parallel the railroad and our right-of-way becomes more constrained. As you can see, this cross section here, the flush median option in the middle does not have that shifted crown, and we end up encroaching into the railroad right-of-way at several locations. So this is another reason why we went with that shifted crown option along this segment rather than centering on the existing roadway. Moving into segment 3, this segment runs from the county line to Velva and has the same options under consideration as segment 2 with the depressed median with the new 2-lane roadway to the south and the flush median with a shifted crown. As noted previously, the paralleling railroad to the north is the primary constraint that we are contending with along this segment. Moving into segment 4, this is the segment through Velva. As I noted, this is our only urban roadway segment along the corridor, and so we have removed the divided depressed option from consideration, as maintaining that depressed grass median would not function well in an urban setting. It would also result in significantly more property impacts due to the larger footprint. So for this segment, we are only looking at a flush median alternative, but have some options for how that might look and function. So first we'll take a look at the design options for the main line. First option, as you see in this figure, is basically a 5-lane section with that middle lane functioning as a 2-way left turn lane. One additional item to note is that this is, and it's relative to all the Velva options, but we are looking at adding a 10-foot wide shared use path along the north side. Second option is very similar, but instead of a flush pave center lane, we've added a raised center median. This raised median would give more of an urban feel to this segment and would likely also help with traffic calming, but would still have brakes for left turn lanes as needed through this segment. Next, we'll take a look at the intersection of US 52 and North Dakota Highway 41. I'm going to start by moving the slider to the left here. This allows us to see the layout of this intersection with the incorporation of both left and right turn lanes. And I will also pull up a visual rendering to get a better idea of what this would look like. So as you see, you would have your 2 through lanes in each direction, as well as dedicated right and left turn lanes at North Dakota 41. Now, as we come back and move the slider to the right, the second option is a similar configuration, but without the dedicated right turn lanes. This option would still maintain the center left turn lanes, but right turning movements would occur from the right driving lane. From a traffic operations perspective, this intersection operates better with the right turn lanes, but dropping those turn lanes would reduce the project footprint and would also benefit the north-south pedestrian crossing across US 52 as it reduces the number of traffic lanes that need to be crossed. Moving on to segment 5, we are looking at the area between Velva and North Dakota Highway 97. And for this segment, the two alternatives we are looking at include the divided depress, but with the new 2-lane to the north rather than the south, as was the case previously. We looking at moving to the south, but for this one will be the new 2-lane to the north, as well as the divided flush median centered on the current roadway. We originally looked at both north and south expansion options for the divided depressed median alternative, but expanding to the south would have had significant impacts to that gooseneck implement dealer located on the south side of the roadway. But ultimately, what took this project or the south alternative off the table was the identification of some cultural sites along the south side of the roadway that could not be avoided with a south expansion option. As we get towards the southern end of this segment, we do have another WAPA transmission line crossing, as well as a substation. And similar to the previous WAPA crossing, our proposed divided depressed alternative would impact an existing tower. So if this option were selected, I would need to coordinate those impacts with WAPA again and get those towers relocated. And finally, moving on to our last segment, which is this segment 6. This segment runs from North Dakota Highway 97 till just past Voltaire, where it would tie into an existing eastbound passing lane that was installed last year. For this segment, we are only considering one alternative, which is the flush median alternative. Part of the reason we are only looking at the flush median alternative is the fact that we need to cross the railroad. As part of a separate project, the NDDOT will be adding acceleration and deceleration lanes at this railroad crossing. So effectively, we will already have the railroad profile established and should hopefully not need to reconstruct this crossing. As we move to the east, where we really become constrained is here near Voltaire, where we have Dakota Midland Grain to the north, and we have a couple of residences located very near the highway to the south. It just is not feasible to fit in a divided depressed roadway without significant negative impacts to these properties. So that brings us through the project corridor. I want to just quickly look at some impact comparisons for the various alternatives. But before doing so, just want to again caveat that we are still waiting on completion of geotechnical investigations and have really not yet gone through the full effort of minimizing and reducing impacts. So the figures we present here are more or less representative of a worst case scenario and will be refined as the study progresses. So looking first at right away, to boil this table down, we're looking at about 255 acres of additional right of way needed at the high end, which is generally representative of the depressed median alternative, and about 88 acres on the low end, which is generally representative of the flush median alternative. Taking a look at wetland impacts, again, we've not yet gone through the effort of trying to minimize these impacts, but currently we're looking at upwards of 15 acres of wetland impacts. So we are anticipating that wetland mitigation will be required and likely the need to acquire an individual permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the last table I'll pull up is the cost estimate. As you can see, we are preliminarily looking at an estimated cost of 169 million to $223 million. So before I wrap it up, just want to pull up the schedule one more time. As I noted previously, we will be transitioning into phase 2 of the 2025, which includes preparation of an environmental document and will also include some additional opportunities for public engagement and public input. So please be on the lookout for notifications of those upcoming additional opportunities. With all that said, we would like to hear any comments that you have on the project at this point. We will be accepting public comments until November 21st. Those comments can be provided to myself, Mike Huffington, either via email or physical mail, and contact information for both alternatives for submitting those comments is on the screen. So with that, just want to thank you for taking the time to view this presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you.